Thanks for listening to A Long Time in Finance with Jonathan Ford and Neil Collins, in partnership with Briefcase.News, the service that brings intelligent curation and analysis to your media monitoring. Whatever happened to good old burglary, the staple of so many old crime dramas? It's down almost 90% since the 1990s in England and Wales, and many other countries have a similar experience. But that doesn't mean we're all behaving better. It just reflects the way crime is shifting from the physical to the online world. Our guest today is an investigative journalist who's made a career out of examining online crime and the way Silicon Valley smarts and technology can be used for nefarious purposes. A one-time technology correspondent on Channel 4 News, Geoff White is an author and journalist who had a hit 2 years ago with The Lazarus Heist, a podcast and book that charted the history of a North Korean hacking gang. Now, in a new book, Rinsed, he turns his attention to cybercrime and the way Silicon Valley tech is helping to launder dirty cash. That's basically a key to all criminal organizations. It's literally what makes crime pay. Now, you open your book with a story about Pablo Escobar, the famous Colombian drug lord, and all the problems he had laundering the money from his cocaine operations. Perhaps you can start by saying a little bit about how technology has revolutionized the money laundering game and moved on since Escobar's time.
Well, yes, exactly. Escobar had a huge problem because, ironically, the thing that made his product so useful, cocaine, was its packageability and its transportability. But what that meant was when he shipped his cocaine to the US, he was obviously having to bring money back to Colombia from the drug sales, and the money took up more space than the cocaine. So for every plane he'd send across the US, he was having to bring back a couple of planes full of money, which just presented him with this huge logistical challenge. And so a large part of his empire became about trying to sort of stash this cash and try and find ways to sort of spend it and finagle it into the banking system. These days, obviously, if you look at dark web drug sales sites, for example, there is no cash. The transactions are all conducted in cryptocurrency and digital format. And so you don't have that sort of logistical, physical headache of cash as a drug dealer. However, you still have to perform the basic functions that any criminal organization has to do with its profits, which is to move it, hide it, and then extricate it. And interestingly, even though it's got slightly easier from a physical, logistical point of view, laundering digital money is probably less backbreaking than laundering banknotes, because now finance is increasingly digitized, the ability to trace and track and potentially freeze money has grown in proportion. So the game now for money launderers is to use technology to launder their money effectively, to hide the trails, to mix it around so that even investigators who can trace the money stand no chance of it getting it back.
But always you need to get it back into the financial system somehow in a clean form, so you can obviously buy whatever assets you're planning to live off in your criminal retirement.
Ideally, yes, but it does depend what kind of criminal you are, which sounds like a strange thing to say. But for example, if you are a cartel drug dealer, you're obviously making millions and millions of dollars. You want to enjoy it. You want to have the fancy lifestyle, the nice car, the nice apartment, and so on. And so for those folks, yes, what you need to do is take your drug money, clean it, so that you can then spend it on all of those luxuries and enjoyable things without it being linked back to the crime. And the reason for that partly is because I think there's an acknowledgement among a lot of organised criminals that at some stage they're probably likely to get caught and do some jail time. Now, that's an occupational hazard, but what they don't want is when they come out of prison to have to start all over again because, their yacht and their apartment have been seized. They want to come out of prison having done a couple of years inside and then pick up where they left off with all of the fripperies and chattels that they had before. However, in terms of getting the money out and sort of spending it on luxuries, yes, for a cartel drug dealer, that might be the aim. But if you're, for example, North Korea, which is accused of hacking into banks and cryptocurrency exchanges and stealing money, you're not necessarily trying to extract the money out so you can spend it on yachts and apartments. That might happen a bit, but the main thing is to have that money liquid so that you can send it around the world. And if, for example, you have somebody in Frankfurt who's going to sell you weapons secrets, or you have somebody in Argentina who's going to sell you missile parts, you can zip the money over there, which you can do in the form of cryptocurrency. You can send it internationally outside the traditional banking system, almost no fees involved, and you can pay off that individual in the local currency in the local area. So how you actually extricate your money after having laundered it depends on what your criminal enterprise is aimed at doing.
Well, it all sounds rather depressing from the point of view of the poor, honest worker. You did mention that one of the things that is not helping them is the traceability of digital transactions. Is that really a serious inhibitor, or it's just something that we could sort of hang on to as a comfort blanket as we watch these billions disappear into the black economy?
I mean, it might be helpful to the listener also for you to just explain a little bit about how the whole laundering process works with crypto. Obviously you don't have Pablo Escobar's problem of great bundles of grey cash. You start with a digital currency and how that process actually works.
Yeah, I mean, to concentrate on cryptocurrencies specifically, which is obviously a large part of the digital money laundering experience, I'm sure people, your august listeners, will have looked at Bitcoin and maybe read a bit about it. The way Bitcoin, for example, as a cryptocurrency works is I will have a wallet, which has a bit like a bank account number. It's got a wallet address. I can then put some Bitcoin in my wallet. And if I want to send it to you, Jonathan, if I have your wallet address, I send the money across and it appears in your wallet. Mm-hmm. That transaction is tracked across a thing called the blockchain, which is a publicly available ledger of all the transactions. Mm-hmm. So you can see that wallet A has sent money to wallet B. Now, you can't always identify who owns wallets A and B, but the transaction is sort of recorded there in the blockchain. And to come to your question, Neil, is the traceability of this currency just something that's a nice to have, a comfort blanket, as you described it? Absolutely not. That the traceability of those transactions is a real headache for money launderers, because it's not only the general public who can see Bitcoin transactions traversing the blockchain, it's also the FBI and the National Crime Agency in the UK. If, as a criminal, you steal money from, let's say, a cryptocurrency exchange, the currency exchange obviously is going to figure out fairly quickly, usually, that they've been robbed. And then they can use the blockchain to see where the money's gone. The FBI, the National Crime Agency, and so on, can in some cases see that the money's been taken to a cryptocurrency exchange, for example, where the thief is trying to turn the Bitcoin into pounds or dollars. The FBI and National Crime Agency can sometimes phone up that exchange or contact them and say, that money that you've just received is profits of crime. You need to stop it and freeze it because we're going to come after you with a warrant at some stage. And that does happen, So the game for the money launderers is to move quickly enough that the law enforcement folks don't have time to keep up with the trade, and or to use underground networks, to use networks of people who won't answer the phone to law enforcement and will help you move your cryptocurrency around. So the traceability, yes, has been a big headache, I think, for money launderers.
Well, you say that, but you can switch it 6 times in a single hour almost nowadays. How on earth would the authorities keep up with that sort of movement?
Well, it's interesting. It's become a sort of cat and mouse game. There are cryptocurrency tracing companies who do exactly that. They try and keep up with all of those switches. Every time the thieves come up with a new tactic, I'm going to change my Bitcoin into, for example, Ether, another cryptocurrency. These cryptocurrency tracing companies will try and come up with new technology that keeps up with what the thieves are doing.
Now, Geoff, we had somebody on not long ago who was a kind of crypto expert. We were interested to know, we said, well, what proportion of transactions on crypto digital currencies that are out there are criminal? And he said, it's less than 1%. And Neil, I remember, almost fell off his chair because he said, no, it's all crooks. But I'm just interested.
Not all.
Well, but I'm just interested because you describe in the book, you talk about these things called mixers, which are where you take crooked crypto and you mix it up in a great blender with lots of innocent transactions, with the idea of exactly doing what you've just been describing, trying to throw the investigators and trackers off the scent. But that's only possible, presumably, because if there is a large proportion of innocent stuff going on. So is it the case that all the kind of craze around crypto has actually helped the criminals infiltrate themselves into the system?
It's a good question. I want to pick up on that point about illicit use of cryptocurrency being sometimes under 1%, because in order to know how much illicit use of crypto there is, you've got to know that the crypto you're looking at is illicit. Identify the dodginess among the non-dodgy. Now, the way a lot of crypto tracing companies will do that, and they're quite open about this isn't a sort of secret really. If, for example, somebody is hit with, let's say, ransomware, criminals encrypt all your files and charge you a ransom to get them back. Ransom's almost always paid in Bitcoin. So at that point, these crypto tracing companies can say, right, The criminals wanted the ransom transferred into this wallet address, so we know that wallet address is receiving ransoms from crime and is a bad wallet address, dodgy wallet address. They can then look at how much money is flowing into that wallet address and all the others that they track, and they can try and get a picture then of how much that adds up to. And that's where the sort of 1% or very small numbers come from. Of course, what those crypto tracing companies can't do is, for example, a drug gang in Manchester who were putting their drug profits of cash into cryptocurrency. They were taking bundles of cash to a murky individual who didn't ask many questions, who would take the cash and swap it into cryptocurrency for the gang and transfer it overseas for them to buy more drugs in exchange for a fee. Now, that activity would not show up in the crypto tracing company's methodology because the crypto is bought with cash. The cash has no obvious history at the time of transfer that it's dodgy. So I'd say that less than 1% estimate is an underestimate. But to go to your point, Jonathan, about mixers, yeah, the way mixers work is you send your cryptocurrency into the mixer. And as the name suggests, it mixes it around with lots of other people's cryptocurrency and then spits it out to a fresh wallet address. So tracing the money in against the money out becomes very difficult. And yes, you're right. If you're going to run a mixer like that, what really helps you is volume and liquidity. The more money's sloshing about and the more violently it's sloshing about, in a way, the better the mix is going to behave, the harder it's going to be to trace transactions through that.
One specific instance that really fascinated me is the heist on Sky Mavis. Not a business that I know anything about, but I read in the FT that they had been scammed of over $600 million. And the thing that struck me about this, apart from the sheer size of it, was their seeming lack of any great concern that this had happened. And they did say, oh, well, we're pursuing, see if we can get the money back. Well, you'd say that anyway. And their backers have now anteed up $150 million new dollars to keep them in business. Is this as extraordinary as it sounds to me?
The short answer is yes. And actually, Neil, I can't tell you the number of crypto companies we've interviewed where the podcast, The Lazarus Heist, for example, as Jonathan talked about, covers North Korean hacks. And one of the things North Korea is accused of hacking is crypto exchanges. And on several occasions, we've spoken to these crypto exchanges and in classic journalistic podcasting style have wanted, them to describe the awful consequences for their business and, the wailing and gnashing of teeth. And what they've actually said is, well, actually, we sort of covered the losses by our profits. So it's amazing how these companies seem to have so much money sloshing about that they can backfill the losses. However, in the Sky Mavis case, it was an astonishing amount of money that went missing. And what's important about that is it was the game players' own money. So Sky Mavis is a company that made a video game. People invested in this video game. They paid money in to be able to play the video game. And when the hackers struck, it was the players' own currency, their own contributions and deposits that the hackers stole. Now, Sky Mavis fought hard to reimburse all of the players. But when you talk to those people, they felt that they actually did lose money out of the back of this. And again, at the back of it, the accusation is that this money was taken by North Korea, for whom $600 million is a lot of money. And given the kind of things North Korea likes to spend its money on, if it did indeed go back to them, that's an extremely worrying turn of events.
It's also worrying in the sense that if you use a company like Sky Mavis as your deposit taker, you're at risk of losing your shirt. And
yes.
And there's no obvious reason why the proprietors of the company wouldn't have an interest in relieving you of some of your money if all else failed.
It does seem very strange to me, but it implies a ludicrously profitable business that they can just more or less shrug their shoulders and say, oh, by the way, we've found backers to put up $150 million to keep the show on the road. I can't help feeling I'm missing something here.
Well, this brings up an important thing which you also touched on in your book, which is about the question of trust. Because essentially what you describe is a world in which essentially as things move online, you kind of mimic on the dark web or whatever it is, a kind of parody of what happens in the normal internet. You have the benefit of distance and scale, which comes from operating online. But you have all the problems that you're not really operating in an open contractual world. You're operating in the world where everything is done on, historically, I suppose, violence, if trust was foregone for some reason. So I'm interested in how they've been able to create this sort of climate of trust, which means that people will, I mean, obviously I'm excluding Sky Mavis here, it's a licit organization, but people will put their Bitcoin or whatever into the hands of Russian dark web marketplaces or expect their drugs or whatever else that they are buying to actually turn up on the nail.
Yeah.
How do you think that's come about? And has it really worked as well as it seems, which is quite terrifyingly well?
Maybe a model for the real life.
No, you raise a very good set of points, Jonathan, because if you work in an illegitimate economy, if you're buying and selling drugs, if you work for an organised crime gang, or if you consume any organised crime products, you have no legitimate recourse. You can't go to the police. By its very nature, you can't go to the police if you're ripped off, for example. And so you have to have some other way of having trust. Traditionally, that has been violence. The problem with cybercrime, certainly, and increasingly financial crime and fraud and money laundering, is the criminals deliberately base themselves in multiple different jurisdictions. What that means is, even if you wanted to break the legs of the person you're working with, you don't know where they are. And a lot of the time in cybercrime, you don't know sort of who they are. And so there have been these very interesting and quite nuanced and complex systems of trust developed. So some famous examples on the dark web were around star ratings and user ratings. So on dark web drug sites, users can leave reviews of the person they bought the drugs from and say these drugs were good or they were bad or they were shipped in a way that exposed me or they were shipped very securely. And so the sellers of the drugs wanted to give a good experience. So they get user ratings because no buyer wanted to buy from someone who had a 0-star rating. The other thing that's interesting is looking at some of the cases around North Korea and the money launderers with whom North Korea worked. It was quite obvious to me that there was a real pressure on those money launderers to do a good job and not rip off their clients, who in this case was apparently North Korea, because you then don't get future work. There is a sort of pressure on people to create some kind of system of trust and to deliver. The other thing about this is, of course, on a dark web forum, I can set up any ID that I like, any username or any identity. What I could then do is rip somebody off and the next day re-register with a different identity and start all over again. But again, if I keep using new identities, I never work up enough trust. I'm always a newbie. I'm always a new unknown factor. So what I want to do is set up an identity and keep it going so people trust it. And in order to be trusted, I have to deliver. The world of trust in dark web marketplaces and organised crime, financial crime and cybercrime generally is really, really fascinating. There was one site where I was on when I was back at Channel 4 News, which was selling credit card data. And I wanted to buy some of this data to see whether it was real. So I bought some Bitcoin and I paid this dark web person and they just vanished with my money. Perhaps predictably, they just ripped me off. So I then reported them to the administrator of the forum. Obviously, they didn't know I was a journalist. They thought I was just a user. And the administrator of the forum got back to me almost immediately, apologized and said, I'm sorry you had this experience. We have blacklisted that person from the site. And in future, we suggest that you use our escrow service where you can put money in and we'll keep it until the deal's signed off. So these systems of trust are really
excellent.
well developed.
So you gave them a 5-star rating, I hope.
Remarkable.
Your book is essentially a series of chapters describing various criminal enterprises and the efforts that are made to bring them to book. But it all feels tremendously sort of whack-a-mole type activity by the police. And do you think we're getting any better at actually solving these crimes?
A short answer, honest answer for me is no, because the way it's working in most investigations that I've covered is that criminal gang X will set up in business, come up with a particular business model, whether it's breaking into crypto exchanges or banks or running crypto mixers or running dark websites. Their enterprise will get to a certain level where it sort of hits the radar, as it were, of law enforcement. Law enforcement then will spend, if I had to put an average on it, maybe it's a couple of years penetrating that organization, working out where they are, who they are, and then comes the sort of crackdown, the hammer falls. Website X is closed down where criminals hung out, or encrypted phones the criminals were using have been decrypted. And we get this, these big news events where, the law enforcement seem to have really dealt them a blow. But of course, within the next few years, the criminals regroup, dust themselves down and come back with some new sort of innovation that learns from their previous mistakes. So you're right, whack-a-mole is definitely the term, but what's the sort of alternative? You can't let these criminal enterprises go. You have to shut them down.
No, of course you have to pursue them. I suppose one thing which does come through is the fact that your book is obviously about how Silicon Valley and technology has helped them disguise their activities and cover their tracks and so forth, the bad guys. I suppose one question which comes to mind, and Silicon Valley, of course, has invented lots of very clever technologies that are extremely useful, such as the ability to use lots of private encryption systems and all the rest of it. The question then is there anything Silicon Valley could do to make its products less appealing to the criminals?
Yeah, no, I think there is more that they can do. There's a sort of fundamental mindset, I think, among cutting edge tech type companies. They have this quite charming, but ultimately not fantastically helpful rosiness view of the power of technology and the technology they create. As far as they're concerned, the answer to all the world's problems is more tech, and ideally more tech of the kind that I'm trying to sell you. There seems to be just a sort of fundamental lack of awareness of any illicit use that their technology might be put to. They seem, time and time again, when I've investigated things and I've gone to the company, they almost seem wounded and hurt that I'm spoiling their party by pointing out that, child sex abusers or fraudsters are hanging out on their platform. It's like, but we're lovely. We're part of the solution. Well, yes and no. So I think there's a change of mindset can be done. The other thing is understanding that creating new sort of pots of value in the world is something that's going to be of interest to criminals and particularly money launderers. So to come back to that Sky Mavis example, here you have a group of computer game nerds, frankly, who built a very successful computer game. And that was how they saw it. We just built this great video game. Isn't it wonderful? What they didn't sort of seem to acknowledge was they'd actually built a multi-million pound store of value in this video game. Players were investing their money in the video game and, as you point out, Jonathan, almost using it as a deposit account. Well, at that point, you're a financial institution. You're just a badly regulated one, and crooks are going to come along and try and abuse you. You need to acknowledge that. So video gaming, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, all these new innovations, they create these huge new stores of value.
Yeah.
How much money is sloshing around in Uber, for example, and Airbnb? These are stores of value in society. Those organizations, those techies need to understand that, you're creating kind of new zones of finance.
Perhaps they should be regulated like banks, since that's what they are.
Of all the stories you wrote about in your book, which one appalled you the most?
There are 2 chapters in the book that are about very serious crimes, and deliberately so. I wanted people to understand that money laundering is not this nice white-collar spreadsheet kind of activity.
Yeah.
There's 2 chapters. One's about prostitution and the other's about child sexual abuse. The child sexual abuse case, which does have a good ending. Somebody did get prosecuted for it. The site was shut down. But the idea that these sort of anonymized or semi-anonymized payment systems could be used to kind of fund that behavior, absolutely horrific. And I suspect things like that, systems like that, cannot be set up without at least some kind of anonymous or semi-anonymous payment method. So that was one that I really thought was horrific.
Yeah, and the one thing which struck me about the one on prostitution, which was a sort of Craigslist type service, it was basically protected. Even though it was selling services which were clearly illegal, it was protected by the fact that free speech legislation in the US, which protects, people like Facebook, not that they're involved in this, I hasten to add, from being deemed to be publishers of anything. They're just sort of sitting there, just sort of posting up bills on the wall. And that is a piece of legislation which ultimately allowed them to do that online, even though everyone professed to be appalled by what they were doing.
So this is the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which I won't quote, partly because I don't remember it, but broadly speaking, what it says is, websites like Facebook and, Twitter, and the site you're talking about is called Backpage, which is a sort of Craigslist classified ad site. These are platforms, they're not publications. So it's not like a newspaper where a newspaper has to vet everything before it goes in, like the August FT. Anybody can post something. If something is reported to this platform, if somebody says, well, hey, this ad here is for something illegal, then they take it down, they're obliged to take it down. But at the point when it's posted and put up, the platform's not liable for it. Now, there's actually a reasonably sensible reason for doing that, because if Mark Zuckerberg had to approve every one of your holiday selfies before they went live on Facebook, you'd be trapped in an infinite queue. This legislation sort of, in a way, makes the internet, or makes at least social media, work and make it workable. The problem, of course, is it's a sort of shoot first, ask questions later approach. What's interesting in the Backpage case is some of the ads on that site were not classified ads for things like bunk beds and caravans. It was for prostitution. Now, prostitution is illegal almost everywhere in the US at state level. But that act that I've talked about, the Communications Decency Act, is a federal piece of legislation. So whenever a state prosecutor would go after Backpage and say, hey, you're enabling illegal activity, i.e. prostitution, the federal level protection would kick in and Backpage would sail on. What's amazing about that case, and to link it back to the book about money laundering, is in the end, what brought Backpage down, they were prosecuted so many times, literally hundreds of accusations and hundreds of prosecutions failed. The one thing that worked, the one charge in the end that got them, was money laundering. Because with money laundering, it doesn't matter what level it's at, state or federal, money laundering is money laundering. The crime was committed and you profited from it, buddy. You are now sentenced. And so they finally took down Backpage, really, when money laundering came into view as part of the prosecution.
A sort of modern version of Al Capone, really.
But Geoff, I mean, we're probably coming to the end here, but I wanted to, obviously it's a terrific book. It left me with two thoughts. One is, one of the things you describe, this sort of global kind of jurisdiction hopping kind of people setting up things anywhere in the world, does make you wonder whether the kind of worldwide nature of the web can survive forever, in the sense that, maybe bit like the Chinese will all end up putting up firewalls to stop bad stuff coming from funny places around the world. The other one was just, if you think about the most uncrackable crimes you described, they have one common feature in Russia or in North Korea, that they have a kind of state-sponsored content in the case of North Korea, and what seems like state, encouragement in the case of Russia. And it does make you wonder, what on earth would happen if we ever really did have a state-on-state cyber war? It would be complete carnage, wouldn't it?
Yes. Cyber Pearl Harbor, as it's termed in a lot of quarters, it has been on a lot of people's minds. What was interesting was when the reinvasion of Ukraine happened in 2022, I think a lot of people started to change their perception, or at least some people started to change their perception and thought, well, we didn't see cyber war. Russia, for all of its cyber, capability and allegedly hacking the US presidential election in 2016 and all of the other stuff Russia's done. And yet when it came to Ukraine, they go in there with tanks and guns, etc. I don't think we'll get to a point where one country will declare cyber war on another one and won't use any other tactics. That seems outlandish. But certainly in terms of conflict and management of conflict, cyber is a huge realm. It's one of the US's commands now. Air Force, Navy, Army, cyber, and space are part of their remit.
Anyway, well, let's hope
those
those
cheerful thoughts.
Yeah, cheerful thought.
on that cheery note. Yeah.
That was A Long Time in Finance with Jonathan Ford and Neil Collins. Production and editing by Nick Hilton, and our sponsorship partner is Briefcase.News. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review it on your podcast app, as that will help new listeners find us.